This talk is called Making Holy Ground, Pilgrimage and Art. I should be looking at the mainly, in this case, Christian activity of pilgrimage and seeing how it relates to ecological concerns, in particular, how we imagine the earth, how we treat the earth, is related to religious practice. And we shall look also at some modern artists who I argue also take up this theme. My first slide here, this title slide, shows the mosaic on the floor of the church at Tabgha, where Christ multiplied the loaves and fishes. And it shows an ideal Egyptian, probably, landscape with birds and snakes and plants, all in a kind of harmony. As a pilgrimage site in Galilee, it was visited by the indefatigable Egeria, a woman from Gaul who made a series of pilgrimages to the Holy Lands in the late 4th century. So it embodies the topic of my lecture, the relation between the holiness of place and pilgrimage. There is a tension in particularly the Christian interpretation of the holiness of the earth, which goes back to Christian interpretations of the Garden of Eden story, which differ somewhat from the rabbinic tradition. Here on the right, you have Gustav Klimt's painting of the Tree of Life, with birds and creatures nesting in its curlicued branches. This represents a mode of knowledge in paradise, which is to do with interconnection, with union, and with knowledge as a form of love and relationality. That was the mode of being of Adam and Eve in paradise. On the left, we have a picture of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is a different form of knowing, a kind of knowing as power, a knowing which seeks to separate itself from the source of life. It brings alienation from God and from nature, and you can see that alienation in the thrusting, thorn-like boughs, beautiful yet also aggressive and potentially violent. And we remember that in Milton's poem Paradise Lost, when Adam and Eve take the fruit and fall from union with God, earth felt the wound, and nature from her seat, sighing through all her work, gave signs of woe that all was lost. The relationship with the earth, with the other forms of creation, is affected by the loss of union with the divine. And so we have the labour of the post-fall world. Here is Adam delving, but Adam delves with some difficulty. The earth resists. There is enmity between the snake and the human. The earth resists, and the earth also suffers. And you can see the need for the redemption of the earth as well as the redemption of the human in St. Paul's writings in Romans 8. The creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. The creation itself will be set free from bondage to decay and attain the glorious liberty of the children of God. But meanwhile, the whole creation has been groaning in travail together until now. Paul has a kind of biopolitics, which means that the eschaton, when Christ returns and the whole heaven and earth come to union and fruition, the earth will be part of that story and will be saved along with humankind. In early Christianity, despite this kind of theology, there is not pilgrimage. Pilgrimage, as we know, is a practice that belongs to most religions, particularly those of the axial age, to Buddhism, to Hinduism, to Islam, to Sikhism. But early Christianity saw itself as the way, but this was an inner movement of the Spirit. The Spirit might move you, as it moved Philip in the book of Acts. It impels people, but there isn't a cult of specifically holy places. This was associated with paganism. And Paul's sermon, as reproduced in the book of Acts chapter 17, includes the words, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in shrines made by man. The new temple is Christ himself." And so as late as the 4th century, the Cappadocian church father Gregory of Nyssa, who had to travel to Jerusalem, emphasized that no traveling around will bring you nearer to Christ. So again, this speaks against place pilgrimage. And yet, of course, there is the belief, as the seraphim and cherubim fling to each other in the vision of Isaiah in chapter 6, "Holy, holy, holy, the whole earth is full of God's glory." So there is the belief that everything is holy, but that this means that you don't need specific sites of holiness. There is Shekinah everywhere, and the painting in the background is a painting called Shekinah Light, God's Glory, by Jules Olitsky. Pilgrimage begins, particularly in the 4th century, when persecution ends and Constantine's conversion means a world safe for Christians to travel around to holy sites if they so choose. But it begins in relation to people, as Robert Marcus's research has shown us. A distancing from the time of the martyrs means that Christians wish to reconnect with that sacred power of the martyrs, with that authentic Christianity. And so they go to seek their tombs. On the right here is the tomb containing the body of San Costanza. They also go to seek living holy people, those who seek what was called the white martyrdom of monasticism. On the left is a photograph of the monastery of St. Macarius in the Wadi Natrun near Alexandria in Egypt. This is a monastery that dates back to the 4th century but is still flourishing today. If you look at the photograph, you can see a great deal of green and a lot of trees inside the walls of the monastery and fields outside. From the very beginning, the monks made the desert bloom. This was seen as a foretaste of the eschaton. When Egeria visited the monks in this area, they gave her eulogium, fruits of their agricultural labour, which were given as holy gifts, a foretaste of the time when the whole earth would be holy and reconnected to God. So the saints, living and departed, make the profane sacred. And by the profane, I mean the world understood as self-subsisting, cut off from its origin in God, but sort of understanding itself as cut off. So that's what St. John means when he talks about the world. He means the world cutting itself off from God. And St. Paul's word, the flesh, doesn't necessarily mean the body. It means, again, everything that cuts itself off from union with God. In pilgrimage, you go to visit holiness, holiness which redeems and reclaims the world and shows its connection to its divine origin. In this same 4th century, there is recourse to the Holy Lands to walk in the footsteps of Christ. Famously, Constantine's mother Helena did it. She was an early archaeologist. Fortunately, the Romans had built a temple of Venus over the site of the Holy Sepulchre, and this was then removed, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built and later rebuilt on the same site. There on the right you can see it, so that Christians could follow the steps of Christ in his passion and see themselves as following Christ morally, but also by walking the same steps in a land of a sacred topography which Christ made holy. On the left, you can see a map from Madaba, part of the map which shows the whole of the Holy Land, but you can actually see a road that the Romans built through the centre of Jerusalem and which Christians could now follow. All the places they might need are there on this map, so that the Holy Land becomes a kind of sacred field of power. Place pilgrimage does return then. It returns for a number of reasons, partly to follow in the footsteps of Christ, partly in the Celtic fringe, because it builds upon a pagan sacred topography. We know that the Celtic saints sought out these places, the holy wells, like this one in Wales, associated with St. Cereal. You get it in Brittany, you get it in northern Spain, in Wales, in Ireland, in Western Scotland. There is a Celtic mysticism represented by the fact that the Celtic saints are very close to animals. We think of the cuddy birds associated with St. Columba and the island of Lindisfarne. In my slide on the right are some modern pilgrims following the steps of Christ, but doing so by following the sands across the Bay of Lindisfarne to go to St. Columba's holy island. And St. Gregory told Augustine, when he came to evangelize southeast England, to actually borrow these pagan sites that people were familiar with and to endue them with Christian meaning. On this slide, you can see how the holiness of the earth in the Holy Land has been transferred to other countries. On the right and the left is the complex of buildings of San Stefano in Bologna. It is modelled on the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. You can see it in the middle, a kind of octagonal building with a kind of pulpit in the middle. On the right, you can see the courtyard with a pool in the middle, a kind of bowl, which is where Pilate could wash his hands, so that a visitor to this complex could follow the way of the cross as if they were in Jerusalem. In the stained glass, you can see an image of the vision of the Lady Richeldis in Walsingham in Norfolk. She had a vision of the Virgin who showed her the holy house in Nazareth, gave her its dimensions, and told her to build a replica in England. In this way, all countries could become Christologically holy. We all know the poem "And Did Those Feet in Ancient Times Walk Upon England's Mountains Green" by William Blake. He probably believed in the legend that Joseph of Arimathea brought the young Christ to England, and that's why it's an idea that he walked on our mountains. But in Blake's poem, it moves towards an idea that the holiness of England will be when we realise the New Jerusalem through our radical ethical acts. In all these cases, there is an idea that any place can become holy. In this slide, we see the theology that undergirds this new development in pilgrimage. It's a theology of incarnation in which the whole earth is seen as holy. I've given two quotations, one from a 20th century Russian theologian, Sergei Bulgakov, in his prose poem, The Holy Grail and the Eucharist. He writes about the moment when the spear pierces the side of Christ on the cross, and water and wine pour out. Sometimes in early representations of this scene in art, you will see a figure of Holy Church catching the fluids in a chalice. This chalice is the Holy Grail, and of course there builds up a whole legendary series of stories about it. But for Bulgakov, the Grail is not a chalice, it's the earth. The piercing of Christ's side makes the blood and water flow into the earth and render it holy, and in doing so render the whole universe the Grail where Christ lives forever. Christ is, of course, the principle of intelligibility in the creation already as word. He shapes the earth. But in his dying humanity, he becomes part of it forever. My second quotation is much earlier. It's from a 12th century sermon for Easter Day, in which Honorius writes, "The earth rejoices today more than all creation, because Christ was born, a man from her material. When he died, he was buried in her bosom, and in his substance she is lifted up above all the angels' dignities." It's very wonderful. The idea is that Christ is born from the earth as a son of Adam, of the earth earthy, and when he dies, he is buried in the earth. And then in his ascension, in his humanity, he raises the earth to heaven. So instead of heaven being up there and earth below, they are now inverted and united. And this idea is shown very clearly in Mantegna's San Zeno altarpiece at Verona, a detail of which you can see on the slide. Christ steps out of his tomb in a really strong way, showing he is fully human, fully material. However, we understand the resurrection. He is also within a tomb, which is within a kind of earthy hill. So it's interesting, the resurrection takes place inside the earth, as it were. And notice how you have a mandala around Christ of cherubim and seraphim. So the angels are within the earth in this kind of topsy-turvy inversion of all the usual understandings of up, down, spiritual, material. They are all broken apart by the incarnation. And therefore, of course, the earth is holy. For you do not, in this kind of pilgrimage, just go to one holy place across a profane landscape, even though you may cross the dangers of the sea and the dangers of travel on the land. Because all the way along, just as in the Camino today to Santiago, to Compostela, you would pass little markers, pilgrimage crosses, special chapels, relics, all sorts of sacred places, rendering the whole landscape a sort of field of sacred power and force. And I put there the remains of a pilgrim cross on the way to Walsingham near Hockingham. I've also given you the Milky Way because in the Middle Ages the Milky Way was renamed the Walsingham Way because it was held to guide you across the fens to Walsingham. So heaven and earth combined to be part of the route. And so in the Middle Ages, everybody goes on pilgrimage, whether it's to their local church, their local shrine, to visit their cathedral, a local saint, to go to Canterbury, to venerate St. Thomas, to go to St. James's shrine at Compostela, or to go to Walsingham. And here is the result of the Reformation: dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII and the destruction of all the holy shrines. All that survives of the great complex of the Augustinian Priory at Walsingham is this arch and a gatehouse. And someone wrote a ballad of woe and lament, the Arundel ballad. Such were the worth of Walsingham while she did stand, such are the wracks as now do show of that so holy land. The whole idea of the shrines, not just as the holy images or relics, but as a holy land, is gone. According to Calvin, the earth does proclaim the glory of God, but this is only perceptible by the elect who are justified and sanctified. And gradually, in the scientific revolution, there is a new interest in creation and the earth, in her particulars, but far less so in the sense of the earth as holy. And in fact, following Descartes, animals are seen as machines, allowing vivisection and other practices whereby nature is decrowned. And so I want to pick the story up next in the Romantic movement, which is at its essence an attempt to reconnect with the holiness of nature. I'm particularly interested in a young German philosopher and geologist who wrote under the name Novalis. His real name was Friedrich von Hardenberg, and he had a short life beginning in 1772 and dying from tuberculosis in 1801. He chose the pen name Novalis because it means one who clears new ground. As I said, he was a geologist and very interested in science, but there is there the sense of one who is interested in newness and in clearing a new space, a space in the earth. And a lot of his poems and stories describe descents into the earth, into the bowels of the earth, to achieve knowledge. He wrote a lot of fragments of a romantic encyclopedia, which had the aim of uniting kinds of knowledge that had become disconnected: science and religion, art and geology. He wanted to bring everything back into reconnection. He wanted, as he wrote in my first quotation, to romanticize the world, which is to make us aware of the magic, mystery, and wonder of the world. It is to educate the senses to see the ordinary as extraordinary, the familiar as strange, the mundane as sacred, the finite as infinite. It's not enough, however, to say, oh, the world is wonderful. We can see heaven in a grain of sand. In order to do that, we have to give up eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We have to give up trying to master the world, to have a view of knowledge as mastery of dead objects. We need to re-enchant the world by raising it to subjecthood. And in order to do that, you have to perform what was later described by Victor Shklovsky as defamiliarization, making the world strange, so that the world of dead objects can be taken out of our perceptual grasp, so that we may receive the world back as separate from us, as having its own being, but as also part of us, so that we share a united cosmos. It's like going back to the Garden of Eden, because, as Novalis wrote, every beloved object is the centre of a paradise. It is to go back to a form of knowledge which unites understanding and will, and is knowledge as a form of love. It's a kind of epistemology that you can find in Thomas Aquinas, and one which had been lost in a world where, even with Kant, who sought in many ways to have a very productive theory of the imagination, there is still a sense in which the world in our perception is a dead world, where everything is under we give it meaning, and the world of things in themselves, the world of noumena, is oddly shadowy, and we have no perceptual access to it. Novalis wanted to get beyond that, and the way to do it was to make things strange, as in this wonderful collage where bits of a street sign have been cut up, photographs of them have been cut up, so that we see the object really strangely, as if it was like one of those books of pictures which look like a series of pixels, but if you screw your eyes up and refocus, an object reappears. So how did Novalis do this? He gave an example of what he called magic idealism, this idea of performing a kind of theurgy, a kind of ritual magic whereby nature is restored, in this novel, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, which was published after his death. And it tells the story of a young man's search for love and knowledge, a search that happens in waking life and in dreams. The young man remembers quite early in the story that his father had had a dream of a blue flower. And one night he also dreams of being in a magical landscape full of beautiful fountains and plants. Until we come to this section. But what attracted him with great force was a tall, pale blue flower, which stood beside the stream, and touched him with its broad, glistening leaves. Around this flower were countless others of every hue, and the most delicious fragrance filled the air. But he saw nothing but the blue flower, and gazed long upon it with inexpressible tenderness. Finally, when he wanted to approach this flower, it all at once began to move and change. The leaves became more glistening. The flower leaned towards him, and its petals displayed an expanded blue corolla, wherein a delicate face hovered. You see there how he begins by contemplating the object with inexpressible tenderness, with love as a mode of knowledge. And instead of being a dead object, it begins to take on agency and movement and transformation. It actually leans towards him to show the union between them. And then a face appears, so that it stops being an object and becomes a subject. And that face opens in him an enormous sense of yearning, what Schiller called Sehnsucht, an idea that C.S. Lewis was particularly keen on. an idea of a kind of longing for something beyond, for a kind of transcendence, a kind of transcendent love, beauty, and truth. And the rest of the novel is a search for those things. But it also represents a new attitude to nature, that there is a synergy, an analogy between ourselves and nature, which happens because we are all creatures of the divine. Novalis was a devout Christian, and he saw that the world was holy. And as we saw our relation with the world, so we would raise it to participation and recognize its holiness. I'm now going to look at three painters who respond to Novalis's ideas. Novalis can be seen to be presenting the whole of life as a kind of pilgrimage, whereby we contemplate and study the world as we travel through it, seeking always the goal of our pilgrimage, which is God himself. Absolute love, absolute beauty. Caspar David Friedrich also experienced human love when he got married in 1818, and the picture on the slide is taken from his honeymoon on the beautiful island of Rugen, off the coast of North Germany. I chose it because this painting seems to me to actually illustrate Novalis's ideas. It's also got a lot of blue, blue as the heavenly colour. Blue in the Middle Ages, the colour of the Virgin's robe, the colour of the heavenly mandorla in the icon, and obviously sourced from lapis lazuli, so something of great monetary value and therefore a sacrificial colour to use in a painting. Here the sea looks like the kind of transcendent that people seek. And they are all contemplating nature. The woman on your left has her arm out, pointing towards the cliffs. The man in the middle, usually identified with Friedrich himself, has his hat off as if he were in church and is kneeling down to contemplate nature and also to cling on because they are quite close to the edge. So there is a certain kind of latent sublimity in the picture, the idea of the sublimity of the terrible and the awe-inspiring. And then on the right, there is a man whose form echoes and leads you up to the tree, which curves to make a kind of circle of interpretation, a hermeneutic circle of the picture. Notice also how we do not have direct access to the sublime sea and sky. In fact, a branch breaks the fullness of the image, as if we need a barrier between ourselves and the fullness of nature, a barrier which is there to prevent our mastery, to prevent even, if you like, the Kantian sublime, where the landscape may be quite dangerous and awe-inspiring, but your thoughts are somehow even higher. Here, nature itself is both the barrier and the invitation. So you are led into the vision of the sea by nature itself. Nature no longer in your perceptual control or even sublimed by your ideas, but nature herself is the object of contemplation. And as creatures with nature, you can adore God who can be experienced within the natural world. And so the people echo the natural forms. They also represent it has been argued by a number of scholars, the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, as talked about by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. These three, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. So love here is represented by the woman. It is love who leads you to knowledge with her arm. This then brings faith. The man in the middle is robed in dark blue, and leads to hope. The man on the right is robed in green, in the livery of one of the Christian confraternities, which were ideas of hope for a more democratic politics, which was not to be realised in the Germany of the time. The theological virtues are those which are infused by God into the soul and which connect the soul with the supernatural. So it's very interesting that Friedrich unites ideas of grace and nature here. Here is a later version of the painting, where you can see that the humans have been removed, but they are represented by natural forms. Charlotte's arm has become a branch. A twisted mixture of branch and leaves is there for Friedrich in the middle, and the hope of the confraternities has now become a stump. But nature is doing its own worship. The two paintings are related. Friedrich wrote some notes to an exhibition which give his ideas on the sublime. He didn't think that the sublime belonged to just great mountains or oceans of fog. It may seem that some of his paintings are about that kind of sublimity, and they often are, because he thinks they're very painterly and significant. But he thinks that the sublime can be found anywhere. And here he writes, "The divine is everywhere, even in the grain of sand. Here I represented it in the reeds." You wouldn't think of a reed as a sublime object. It is transient, it is ordinary, it moves with the wind as here, but he gives it utter significance, utter beauty. And look how the swans raise their necks to follow it. For him, the natural world is an analogy for the divine, as well as a mirror of internal human architecture. Very often he has been seen to be representing ideas of the human body through representations of nature. This is a bit like a representation of the human heart. So the whole earth for Friedrich. The whole earth for Friedrich is holy. Its beauty speaks of God. So you can think of all his art as a kind of pilgrimage art. In fact, many of the natural forms he shows have a church or a crucifix within them. The crucifix, I would argue, is a kind of guarantor of the holiness of the natural landscape, and that becomes very clear in the image on the left, which has been mounted in a kind of shrine, almost as if it had a little kind of altar below, and the natural picture forms a kind of reredos behind it. And there are a kind of the rays of the sun coming off from the sunset are ambiguous. It's almost as if they might be emanating from the earth itself, again to show the holiness of the earth. And the presence of the crucifix, I think, is interesting because, again, this has a kind of theology behind it. The idea that Christ's death took place outside the holy city of Jerusalem, holy to the Jews, the pilgrimage site for their practices, in the place of the skull at Golgotha, which was a place of blasphemy, of the profane. But as Christ accepts a shameful death in the place of abjection, this makes this place also holy, and therefore the crucifix can become an image of the holiness of place. My second image from Kiefer is Palm Sunday 2006. I chose it because it represents a pilgrimage. It represents the people in Jerusalem for the Passover feast who come out with their palms to welcome Jesus. They come out with palms, partly because there are palm trees in the city, but partly because palms are a sign of victory, and they come to welcome their Messiah. Now, this is Anselm Kiefer, so what do we have? We have a dead palm tree lying on its side, and as you visit the installation, you walk round the dead palm tree. Behind it, however, are 39 glass vitrines, little boxes, in which are preserved leaves and other plant forms, along with earth. You can see the cracked earth in the example I've put on the slide. As you move around these, it is as if you are moving round a reliquary on a rather gigantic scale. If you've ever visited sort of dusty diocesan museums in small European Catholic towns, you often find that they put all sorts of reliquaries in them. And sometimes they take the form of lots and lots of little glass boxes with little bits of bone and labels of different saints. Here we seem to have the same thing, except what is holy here is the form of the earth itself, the plants. And there are words over some of the plants, just like the relics. And in Latin is the words of Isaiah 45:8. Let the earth open, and let them bring forth salvation, and let righteousness spring up together. So there is the idea that out of the dead earth, and remember in the context of Isaiah, it is a dead earth. He's thinking of the Davidic line, which has completely died out. So a branch out of the root of Jesse would be a miracle indeed. Here is the idea that righteousness and truth should come out of the earth, a kind of hope. And there is, of course, a kind of hope in the dead palm tree, because palm trees are never quite dead. There is an idea that there is also always the possibility of life coming out of them. And this palm tree is also preserved through a kind of resin. Paradoxically, in early Christianity, the deadness of the bones is the promise of new life. And it's the same here. It's almost as if we as humans understand the deadness of the earth that we have created by our own actions, we are in the beginning of bringing new life. My final artist is the very popular Olafur Eliasson, whose in real life exhibition I hope some of you may also have had a chance to visit at Tate Modern last autumn and early in this year. I chose it because it seems to me that he is an example of an artist who is influenced by Caspar David Friedrich. He actually uses Caspar David Friedrich's kind of colour palette for some of his experiments in this exhibition. And also that he reaches back to an idea of art as participation, and even, I would argue, something we might call magic idealism. You've got there on this slide one of the most popular of his installations, where everybody makes shadows. They come in as individuals, but despite themselves, they make a communal work of art. Even if you were to try to make an action which spoilt the harmony of the picture, it would not, because the way the thing is set up in its doubling means that you always form part of a pattern. One might see this as a kind of representation of the classical and Christian idea of the common good, an idea taken up by other faith traditions, an idea that there is a good, an actual good, which is good for each of us, and which is greater than our own individual fulfillment, or rather, we will find our fulfillment as people in this interconnected common good. And I think that's part of the pleasure of this installation. The other part of it, of course, is the fact that you make meaning. It is a bit like Novalis and the Blue Flower. You actually call the light into meaning through your action. It is a kind of magic in that sense. It comes also through a kind of familiarization. Here are two examples of Eliasson's making strange. He is very interested, I ought to have said earlier, in questions of ecology. In this same exhibition are photographs of the withdrawal of glaciers in Iceland, a country where he has spent much time, and which is part of his sense of the imaginary. And so here we have two ways in which he makes nature strange. On the left, you are actually looking at water. It may not seem like water. As you move towards it and move through it, you experience the water. But it's water become a kind of curtain. Water made strange. Water, in fact, played upon by a light which sometimes sheds a kind of rainbow effect upon it. So that you experience water almost as an encultured thing. On the right is something that, in a sense, replicates the geysers that are so much a part of the Icelandic landscape. You go into a totally dark room and water is bubbling up from the floor, and occasionally a strobe of light plays upon it, and at that moment it is frozen. It looks two-dimensional, as if you're looking at a slide of a light form, so that the water is completely defamiliarized, completely made strange. And that's true of many, many of the installations in this exhibition. Here are another two, which really take away your sense of mastery. Remember how important that is, that idea of giving up knowledge as control, mastery of the world, in terms of knowledge as love, participation, and interdependence. So the first is a wall made up not of brick, but by spongy stuff. It's a kind of reindeer moss, and there's a whole wall of it that you can feel. So we tend to think of a wall as a resistant medium, but this is a living wall. Again, it plays across ideas of the cultural and the natural, which of course in a theology of creation are the same, because the world is God's art. And again, in Friedrich and in Novalis's theology, art and nature are one, and magic idealism is a form of art as well as a form of religious practice. The other installation is one where humans are invited into a corridor. A gallery attendant opens the door for you to control the numbers of people. There is a form of social distancing so you don't all bump into each other. And so in a sense, this art installation gives you a foretaste of the liturgical practice of social distancing, where we all perform a kind of dance, a kind of kenotic giving way to the other as each of us walks along the road, making it safe for other people. So the psychopomp, the ritual enabler, the art gallery attendant, opens the door and lets you into a corridor where you are in a deep, deep coloured fog, where forms loom towards you, where you lose any sense of understanding of space and must feel your way forward slowly. It's very beautiful. And you come to enjoy the sense of enclosure, the sense of time slowing down. Again, it's a bit like that early Christian idea of pilgrimage, where you're taken into another time by the act of pilgrimage, back to the time of the martyrs, until you emerge the other side. And so I am arguing that Eliasson gives one a form of art as participation, art as magic idealism, freeing the world from our perceptual control to receive it back. One way in which we receive the world back in his art is through his use of geometry. In that in real life exhibition, there was a whole room full of geometric experiments, which he has been involved in for many years in collaboration with Einar Thorstein. On the right of my slide, you can see a beautiful lamp that he has made from acenhedrons nested inside each other. And there are other forms based on geometric patterns and mirrors and light reflections. Why do I think geometry is important here in a sense of pilgrimage? Pilgrimage is based on geometry. It's based on an idea that there is meaning in the cosmos, and so is mathematics. Mathematics is based on an idea that there are real relations that you can depend upon and you can use to make forms. These forms depend upon certain mathematical laws. And these laws are real. They are proportional. They're also proportional between our body and the universe. And of course, we used to use for measurement our thumb, our span, our arm, our body, because there is an analogy between ourselves and the universe, a mathematical analogy. And geometry and mathematics depend upon an idea that all this is real and built into the nature of the universe. And this is, in a sense, a kind of metaphysical universe, a universe in which patterns are the way things are. And we are part of this greater pattern. Buddhist tankas, those beautiful patterns that the monks make in sand sometimes, are based upon sacred geometry. The cathedral is based upon sacred geometry. Pilgrimage sites are aligned according to sacred geometry. And therefore, I would argue, one's participation in the art of Olafur Eliasson and its geometry pleases because it gives you a sense that you are part of a holy cosmos, a holy earth. And therefore, I argue that his work can be thought of as an act of pilgrimage. I haven't reproduced it here, but there is a wonderful kind of corridor, a spiral corridor that you walk along in his exhibition, where your reflection makes the patterns, but so does the geometry which enables that patterning. So there is a synergy between us and the universe, a fit. And I would argue that any response to the ecological crisis depends upon our understanding that we live in this kind of synergy, and we need to be respectful of the kind of patterns in the particles of our universe and in its larger structures. So how can we perform pilgrimage in lockdown? My final artistic example is a map. It's a map of Paris, and it proceeds out of psychogeography, a movement among a radical political group called the Situationists, following the principles of Guy Debord. The idea of the derive. The derive is an idea of deviation. You set out for a walk, but instead of following a map that somebody else has made for you, instead of following signs in a city that lead you to the principal sites, that tell you what are the important places, instead you walk aimlessly, like a 19th century flaneur. You might decide to turn right every time you meet a choice of ways. On this map, you have parts of Paris cut out and reconnected with different arbitrary modes of connection, which are not those normally taken by the roads. My husband follows a family practice on Boxing Day, which you could also follow. You've got to be a bit careful that people keeping your distance, whereby he and the children would leave the house and follow the first person they saw until that person went to ground by entering a building or stopping, having a cup of tea or something. They would then follow the next person until they found themselves home. This also is an idea of the derive, because you are doing something arbitrary which reveals the world to you in a new way. And we could do that on our daily exercise. You might find yourself up a cul-de-sac looking at some dustbins. You might find yourself discovering paths and places you didn't know existed. You might find something beautiful. The idea is that you make meaning, and a meaning which is antithetical to that of authority. We are under authority a lot at the moment for our own good, but following the derive is a way of doing what we're supposed to do, but also finding a kind of freedom. I would argue it is also a form of pilgrimage, because as I've written on the slide, as all the earth is holy, any walk we take can take the nature of a pilgrimage. We can offer it in prayer for someone who is ill. We can offer it as a form of atonement, like Anselm Kiefer. We can offer it as a form of contemplation, whereby by attending to that which is normally overlooked, we raise it to full presence and sense of its own meaning and holiness. We reconnect it to ourselves and God. We bless it. That's what blessing is. If all the earth is holy, when we bless something, we either set it aside for particular use in a holy place, or we express its reconnection to its original holiness as God's creation. We express all that God means towards it: life, love, goodness, full flourishing. That's what we do when we bless something. And we're all in need of blessing at the moment. And pilgrimage is a form of blessing. You go for blessing, but your walking is a form of blessing. So aimless walking becomes pilgrimage through redemption of the ordinary, and again through this quasi-Kabbalistic idea of repairing the disconnected, mundane, a world that is alienated and fallen, a world of violence and injustice. Walking recognizes that too. You will see bad things as well as good, but through your walking, through your witnessing, through your derive, you can redeem and reconnect the world. So that is the end of my contribution to the Holy Ground events. I apologise for its amateur nature, for my coughing, and for the fact that you don't see me. I've broken my arm and I am not a particularly aesthetic sight at the moment. But I hope that we have all understood something of the holiness of the earth, the importance of our recognising the holiness of the earth, and of all of us performing acts of pilgrimage.